Spider-Man video games have changed a lot in the 3D era of gaming. The Spider-Man games we have now take over 5 years to put out a single entry, whereas during the early to late 2000s, we saw over 5 Spider-Man games, each of them bringing incredible innovations to the table in different ways. Some of them had ground-up mechanical changes like in Spider-Man 2, and others had wildly different artistic overhauls like Ultimate Spider-Man. Today, I will go over the development process of all of the Treyarch Spider-Man games, of which almost all were incredibly influential in letting us truly feel like Spider-Man. And for the sake of this video, I'm only covering the Treyarch Spider-Man games released for the original Xbox, Xbox 360, PS2, and PS3. Starting with Spider-Man 1. Spider-Man 1 was developed in 18 months. The game was designed to be a linear or mission-based game, and the web swinging mechanics were basic compared to its sequel, with strands shooting into the sky without attaching to anything. This game adhered very closely to the formula of how to adapt a movie into a game at the time. And that formula was to have most of the action scenes from the movie, have similar mechanics to other popular types of games, and add a couple of new storylines in addition to the movie. Enemies in the quote-unquote open world were confined mostly to rooftops, as if you tried to land on the roads, it would kick you back to the New York skylines. One thing to note about the development of this game is that Jamie Fristrom, the lead technical designer on this game, wasn't too happy with the web swinging that they had in the game. The swinging was basically flying and webs were cosmetic. During development, Jamie, who was the father of these games, would go late at night to work on a completely new system where webs wouldn't attach to the sky, but corners of buildings, and then physics would take over and you would swing like a pendulum. The team at Treyarch saw the prototype of the physics-based web swinging and said no to fully implementing it, as they were already too far along in the development process, and there would be no time to iron out the kinks. Despite these tight deadlines and expectations of adhering to a movie's story, Treyarch still poured a ton of love into this game. One of my favorite things to do in this game as a kid was flying around as the Green Goblin. Despite it being a Spider-Man game, it was a nice addition to the game with brand new mechanics exclusive to the glider. But there was one person who was not happy at all with the ability to play as the Green Goblin. And that person was Sam Raimi. Raimi was focused on telling a very specific story in the film, and he felt that having Green Goblin playable in the video game was a deviation from his vision, which is really interesting as there are a ton of elements in this game that also deviate from the story, like having Kraven or Scorpion or the various side storylines here. But regardless, he was the chief creative vision for the franchise, so playing a villain would be off the table for Spider-Man 2. Additionally, there was a cheat code that let you play as Mary Jane Watson. While I think it would have been hilarious to swing around as MJ, it was pulled from the re-releases of the game, since it allowed the player as Mary Jane Watson to kiss Mary Jane Watson. Spider-Man 1 sold well over 1 million copies before the release of Spider-Man 2, and while it didn't achieve as good reviews as the sequel, it was a foundational game that led to the hyper-successful sequel. Development on the follow-up sequel to Spider-Man 1 began almost immediately after the first game shipped. While the original game had an 18-month development cycle, this one would be bumped up to a full 2-year development cycle with over 80 people working on the game. This game was in development in an era where Grand Theft Auto had blown up the industry and redefined what an open-world game was, so Treyarch set out to do the same exact thing for Spider-Man. The first thing that Treyarch started working on was the physics-based swinging. At first, they went through the level and added points which they thought would be good to swing from, like corners of buildings for example, but the physics were too variable and uncontrollable at this point. In fact, it was in such an early state that the teams kept higher management away from the prototypes of the physics-based swinging. Since it was early in development, it was very flawed, and if higher ups saw it in the state it was in, they would have wanted development to halt on the new swinging system entirely. The developers discovered that the more points they add in, the more predictable, smooth, and fun swinging got. So, from the concept of adding points, they implemented a system that did raycasting against the physical geometry, and where the rays intersected, that's where the swinging would happen. Once they added raycasting, they showed the prototypes to higher ups and they loved it. There was nothing like this in the games industry at the time, and it was truly a special sauce moment for the game. Like Halo Combat Evolved revolutionizing FPS games on the console, or GTA pioneering the open world formula into the mass market, Spider-Man 2 would usher in a golden age for superhero games. It was one of the first superhero licensed games to incorporate the open world style. Treyarch took the formula from the GTA open world and built a whole superhero storyline around it. One problem during development though was since GTA was a bit slower paced, they were able to handle the level loading in new areas a lot easier. This was a major problem with Spider-Man, however, since he was swinging through the city at very high velocities. They were able to resolve this though with relying heavily on LOD, which is why in the modern era, if you revisit the game, you may notice pop-in occurring more than games nowadays. In fact, since this game was designed for the PS2 and original Xbox, they actually had to cap the speed at which Spider-Man was swinging around. Not because it was a gameplay decision, but because the hardware simply couldn't handle the fast LOD switching. While Treyarch loved the swinging in this game and continued to get the game into a good place, they were also pushing for even more villain variety. In the final game, the major villains we got were Doc Ock, Shocker, Mysterio, and Rhino. But originally, Treyarch wanted Kraven, the Lizard, and Kingpin in the game as well. The problem with Kingpin at the time was that the rights to Kingpin were tied to Daredevil. Sony and Marvel went back and forth with Treyarch and Activision, but ultimately they just couldn't cut a deal for this game to have a Kingpin storyline. But regardless of Kingpin, Treyarch was still extremely proud of this game. It was one of the first Spider-Man games to have the world you play in actually feel like you are Spider-Man, with physics-based web swinging. But more importantly, players loved the game too, and it went on to sell over 2 million copies. But immediately after the physics-based web swinging was complete, Treyarch would branch off and create a new team that was simultaneously working on a new type of Spider-Man game, before Spider-Man 2 even shipped. Okay, now on to one of my favorite Spider-Man games of all time, Ultimate Spider-Man. Treyarch had tons of experience working with movie tie-ins at this point, but this was the first time they were given full creative liberty over the entire game. Their ultimate, no pun intended, goal with this game was to appeal to a wider audience, and the audience they wanted to tap into here was the comic book community. Everything about this game would be about bringing the comic book experience to life. They hired Brian Michael Bendis to help craft the game's story, and for those who don't know, Brian Michael Bendis was the person who created the Ultimate Spider-Man comic line. If there's anyone who knew how to craft a true Ultimate Spider-Man story, it was him. Development on Ultimate Spider-Man began in June of 2003. The team grew from roughly 80 people working on Spider-Man 2 to over 100 people for Ultimate Spider-Man. Treyarch took the work done on Spider-Man 2, specifically the physics-based web swinging, and smoothed it out a bit. Just like Spider-Man 2, the web swinging was one of the first things they made for this game. But since the prototype started out as a fork of Spider-Man 2, they were able to spend less time creating the web swinging from the ground up. Instead, they diverted their attention to making the swinging feel more arcadey. The development of this game was driven by the notion of bringing a living comic book experience to a new media. Treyarch grabbed everything they possibly could from the Marvel comics to put into this game. They had to create a new technology specific to this game called 3D comic inking. This process involved cell shading, which as far as I can tell, we wouldn't see in a mainstream video game until Borderlands in 2009. Adding this technology was the first step in bringing the game together. In fact, right after the swinging was in a good state, this art style is immediately what they started working on next. Implementing this tool allowed Treyarch to easily transition bringing the comic book pages into the video game. They would use it for the cutscenes where characters would jump from one comic book panel to the next and throughout the character designs. This process allowed them to rapidly iterate and bring this game to market much sooner. This would also be the first Treyarch game to not only incorporate Venom into the storyline, but make him a playable character character as well, revisiting the Goblin mode from Spider-Man 1. However, this time, the team was effectively working on 2 different versions of the game at once. One about Spider-Man and his usual antics, and another about Venom, which had a completely different tone than playing as Spider-Man. From the very beginning, they worked on what key differences would separate the two. The easiest one to go after first is that Venom really doesn't care about killing people, especially in this game. You can literally eat almost any NPC you see. One super fascinating aspect of this game is that you can see ripples of GTA influence here too. Just like how Spider-Man 2 reinvented the open world system seen in GTA, this game would also reinvent the wanted system from GTA as well. If you killed enough civilians as Venom, your wanted meter would go up and eventually S.H.I.E.L.D. would come in to kill you. As a kid, I remember wishing that if I was able to fight them long enough, that Spider-Man would come and try to take me down instead. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find anything in my research on if that was ever planned in the development of this game, but I think it would be really cool. Oh, and one thing to note, this game had one of the best soundtracks out of any Spider-Man game I've ever played, and the only one that ever came close was Insomniac's Spider-Man from 2018. Just give it a listen. Even all these years later, I still find myself randomly humming the beat of some of the tracks here, even when I forgot where the melody came from. The game would be in development for roughly 2 years, to be released in September of 2005. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any sales numbers for this game. However, I do know that fans, including myself, hold on to the opinion that this is one of the best Spider-Man games of all time, if not the best. The success of this game ultimately laid the groundwork for future comic book inspired games like Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time. And now we have Spider-Man 3. The failures of this game were so disappointing to me when I played it when it first came out. Coming off the incredibly saturated and cartoony look of Ultimate Spider-Man, you would expect to see some type of vibrancy from the art style in this game, but unfortunately that was not the case. Development of Spider-Man 3 began in late 2005 to early 2006. Treyarch knew this would be the first Spider-Man game to usher in the next generation of gaming with the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Right off the bat, Activision wanted this game to appeal to a wider audience. Just like Ultimate Spider-Man, where the wider audience they wanted to capture was comic book fans, this game would attempt to capture even more movie fans and entice them to buy a PlayStation 3. Hell, even the font of the original PlayStation 3 was the exact same font as the movie and the game. Treyarch began development of this game wanting to improve web swinging and combat. They added in QuickTime events and more action-packed cutscenes to drive home the cinematic feel. In fact, Jamie Fristrom, who was the lead technical lead of Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2, the guy who helped pioneer the physics-based web system, left midway through development of Spider-Man 3. He said that one of his biggest beefs with Spider-Man 3 was the QuickTime event system. He was having trouble steering the game to what he wanted it to be. He called out Tomo Moriwaki, who spearheaded the game's combat system. The system they made in this game anticipated what Arkham Asylum would do later. It was up close and personal and about mixing up your targets. He left around the same time Jamie did, and that system disappeared with him, unfortunately. Originally, Treyarch were making the game with just the regular Spider-Man, but during development, they were told that they would need to incorporate the symbiote version of Spider-Man 2. This led to Treyarch building mechanics from the ground up for the symbiote version, including the development of the Rage mode, which we would see take a slightly different form in their next game. This game seemed like it had a de-emphasis on art, as a lot of the buildings were blocky and almost grayscale. The game would also be juggling 10 different storylines, of which one of them was a close adaptation of the movie's story. Despite this, they wanted even more content in this game, including a storyline for Black Cat. This was ultimately cut from the game, with the only remnants existing are this Black Cat character model. We can see it slightly resemble Web of Shadows Black Cat here. In fact, this game seemed like it was a prototype for Web of Shadows entirely, as in the debug menu of the game, you can actually switch over to a prototype version of the Web of Shadows Spider-Man suit. But we did, however, kind of see the return of playable enemies. In the PlayStation 3 version of the game, Treyarch added in the ability to play as Harry Osborn's Goblin. You would be able to fly around on his glider, and he had his own special combat system. We would see Kingpin for the first time in Treyarch's Spider-Man games as well. It seems like they were able to iron out the licensing deal with Marvel and Sony here. But despite the troublesome development and various amounts of cut content from the game still sold like crazy, as it was a poster child for the PlayStation 3. And as you can tell, they were already hard at work on Web of Shadows during the development of Spider-Man 3, which would be the last Spider-Man title that Treyarch ever worked on. Web of Shadows is the most interesting Treyarch Spider-Man game to me. Not only was it the first Spider-Man game to have a branching narrative, but it was a return to Treyarch's non-movie tie-in games. This game and Ultimate Spider-Man were the only times Treyarch was able to have full autonomy in the storyline, and to nobody's surprise, they were also the games with the most acclaim besides Spider-Man 2. Development began around the middle of Spider-Man 3's development cycle, which puts it around late 2006 to early 2007. This would also be the first game from Treyarch that we would see webs attaching to skies again. While it diminishes some aspects of the Spider-Man power fantasy, it made the game more accessible to newcomers. According to Jamie Fristrom, people who play a mass market brand like Spider-Man probably don't want their game to be hard. They just want to press a button and swing. This game was built on top of Spider-Man 3, with Treyarch addressing feedback of the world not looking too stellar in that game. I think the art style of Web of Shadows is awesome, especially when the symbiote takes over the city. Treyarch spent time during development of this game to add destructible environments with buildings and objects breaking and cars being thrown around in the same fashion as Ultimate Spider-Man. And the cast of this game was absolutely crazy. We got Black Cat, Luke Cage, Wolverine, Venom, Kingpin, Black Widow, Electro, a Moon Knight cameo, Rhino, the Tinkerer, and Vulture. Treyarch somehow managed to pull together this wonderful cast without the game ever feeling too bloated. Unfortunately, I don't have too much development insight into this game, but I was able to find some concept art from a cancelled sequel to this game. The concept art shows us a couple of different villains that were planned for the sequel. We have concept arts of Carnage and Mysterio. I just want to call out how freaky Mysterio looks in this concept art with the skull in his fishbowl. I would have loved to see a sequel to Web of Shadows. Unfortunately, this game was cancelled due to quote-unquote shifts in the gaming industry, which I believe was entirely because Treyarch hit a gold mine with Call of Duty. Web of Shadows would release in October of 2008, and World at War would release that same November. And as we know, the current state of Treyarch is entirely focused on Call of Duty, and with Insomniac at the helm of the Spider-Man franchise, I have little hope in ever seeing this cancelled sequel again in the future. I do have one more Spider-Man game that would have been made by Activision to talk about. I have a prototype of a cancelled Spider-Man 4. This game wasn't going to be made by Treyarch, so I won't go into too many specifics in this video, but I did make a video covering what this game would have been and why it was cancelled. There were some really cool mechanics in this game that I was disappointed to see cut, and some that we would never see again in the Spider-Man video game franchise. I'll have it linked down below for you if you want to check it out. Treyarch's 8-year run with the Spider-Man franchise was one of the most influential eras of Spider-Man. They were able to push out 5 Spider-Man games, all of which had rapid iteration and significant advancements in superhero gaming. From the foundations built in Spider-Man 1 to the industry-defining physics of Spider-Man 2, which set a new standard for the franchise going forward. Then, they set off and created a love letter to comic book fans with Ultimate Spider-Man. And then, despite the problems they faced during the development of Spider-Man 3, they were able to close out their era of Spider-Man with a bang when they released Web of Shadows. Nowadays, Spider-Man games feel much more produced, with titles taking over 5 years to develop. If you guys want to see how Insomniac created their Spider-Man Spider-Man games, I've made some awesome videos diving into the development process of them, and I'll have them linked down below in the comments section. And if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more, feel free to leave a comment with what game I should cover next. As always, I appreciate your support and hope you enjoyed this look into my all-time favorite games that I grew up playing. Thank you.